They left a small iron key under a ceramic frog on the mantel, the kind of detail that sounds like a prop in a cheap mystery novel until you hold the key and the drawer it opens and find a stack of files stamped with dates nobody in the town wanted anyone to read. The series is reconstructed from witness testimony, police reports, court filings, audio recordings, ground-penetrating radar results, and first-hand accounts gathered over 3 years of reporting. What follows are 8 cases from Alabama backroads and the woods beyond them, each one anchored in paperwork and eyewitness testimony, each one ending with questions the official record does not answer. We begin where a single ordinary object, a key under a ceramic frog, cracked open a pattern that reaches farther than anyone expected. The file cabinet sat in an attic room behind faded wallpaper and boxes of county fair ribbons. It had been hauled up in 1993 from the Raymond estate, according to the handwritten inventory found with it, and placed beneath a stack of quilts with a polite note, "Do not open until probate complete." When Michael, an heir and reluctant custodian of that house, finally turned the key decades later, he found 3 metal drawers of paper, photocopies of checks, maintenance invoices, minutes from the Town Preservation Committee, and a short typed note that read simply, "Payment approved." The documents appeared to be small-town bookkeeping at first glance, town hall fonts, stamped dates, signatures in a looping hand. But buried in the stacks were unusual items, a ledger of unmarked deposits into an account labeled Roadworks, memos from a contractor with the letterhead Tri-State Environmental Solutions, and a series of incident reports, one labeled Incident Report 4J, that recorded sinkholes, unexplained vehicle failures, and a single terse entry, "Invoice covered, no further action." A photocopy of a canceled check dated July 15, 1987, showed a payment from the county's general fund to a numbered corporation tied in corporate filings to an offshoot of Tri-State. The check stub included the narrow note, "Quarry remediation." People in small towns are used to the kind of paperwork routine that looks like cover. What set these papers apart were the accompanying photographs. Polaroids taken at a quarry embankment showing trucks at night, heavy drums being lowered into the bed of a creek, and a sequence of frames that captured workers covering something with fresh dirt. A handwritten note on the back of one photo read, "Do not tip, bottles flagged." Another photograph, stamped Millbrook Roadworks, September 9, 1986, showed what investigators later described as unnatural staining along the banks of Lockhart Creek. Michael turned one page and found a typed memo from the county's Preservation Committee. Named on the memo were 2 local officials, John Brennan, chair of the Preservation Committee, and Vic Hughes, listed as liaison to Tri-State. The memo recommended a permit be fast-tracked for site remediation with a parenthetical note, "See attached for compensation plan." The attached document, a photocopy of a contract, included a clause promising discretionary payment for site relocation, language unusual for public projects, and, according to an independent municipal attorney we later consulted, potentially unlawful. These records were not anonymous tips. They were found in a deceased man's house with multiple provenance markers, envelope stamps, probate logs, and Raymond's own handwriting on the inventory. The first page we photographed for this project was labeled in a fountain pen scrawl, "Cabinet D, Bill Files, Do Not Burn." The existence of the files aligned with an earlier, dismissed complaint from the 1980s, a neighbor's handwritten account of trucks moving at night and a rotten chemical smell. That neighbor's note, dated October 1986, was among the documents in Cabinet D. We traveled to the Millbrook Quarry on an afternoon when the sun made the old shale beds look like raked anthracite. The air had a metallic tang that locals shrugged off as the way the river smelled after a rain. At the quarry entrance, a security sign bore the Tri-State logo and a phone number disconnected years ago.
An independent geotechnical analysis we commissioned found layers of fill inconsistent with the historical geology maps on file with the county. Ground-penetrating radar scans on the date-stamped coordinates from Incident Report 4J showed anomalies consistent with disturbed fill and compacted voids, two features that correspond with large-scale dumping. The GPR report, marked GPR Scan Site 6A, scan date 06/12/2019, included cross-sections annotated by the surveyor, layer inconsistent with natural bank, suggests fill deposit between 1984-1990. Compounding the physical evidence were bank records, the canceled check to Tri-State, deposit ledgers from an account used by the Preservation Committee, and a string of payments to a subcontractor with no listed employees. A forensic accountant who reviewed the files for us identified a pattern: payments routed through shell companies described as consulting or remediation at times and amounts that matched the timing of insurance claims filed by a small number of residents whose houses were later condemned for soil instability. In at least 4 files, demolition orders followed within months of sinkhole reports filed with the county building inspector. One claim form included a line entry, collapse, homeowner evacuated, structure unsafe, see Incident 4J. We interviewed a woman who, in the late 1980s, ran the Mount Zion General Store and kept a ledger of everyday life in the town. She remembered a series of fix-it vans that arrived in the middle of the night and went straight to the quarry access.
She told us, in a voice that barely hid exhaustion, that they paid a lot of people off to look the other way, and that when she asked a county councilman about the trucks, he told her, "We need jobs, we can't ask too many questions." That councilman's reply is not recorded in any public record we could locate. It lives in oral history, corroborated by at least 3 other testimonies and by the pattern in the paperwork. A second thread began in a different place, a Preservation Committee meeting transcript from 1987 that showed John Brennan making an unusual motion to relax spoil disposal requirements for any contractor working on roadworks. The motion passed 4-2. In the minutes, a staffer typed in the margins, "Emergency exemption, Tri-State." When we sought comment from Brennan, his son provided a statement that the elder Brennan was retired and ill and declined to answer further questions. Public records show he died in 2001. Vic Hughes, listed as a liaison, denied wrongdoing through a family attorney who provided a photocopy of a letter from Tri-State claiming environmental permits were in order and that all drummed materials were hazardous waste certified. The letter was undated. The complaint pattern escalated when an audio recording surfaced, long after the events it described. It was not audio from a witness, but a mechanical log from a contractor's timestamp device, a magnetic tape that recorded start-stop times for the quarry's equipment. That tape, labeled Drum Loader 3, 9/11/86-2322, showed a series of activity bursts between 11:20 p.m. and 03:14 a.m. The tape was analyzed by an audio technician who concluded the frequency signatures matched heavy mechanical loading and, in the seconds between bursts, an intermittent human voice saying, "Cover it, quick." The tape's provenance was complicated. It had been found in a box of scrambled media in the Raymond estate, with a photocopy of a payroll stub from someone listed as truck operator. The operator's name is indefinido in public filings, listed in payroll, not in any arrest log. What connects the documents to the deeper horror is not just the dumping itself, but the pattern that suggests profit extracted through displacement. Among the files in Cabinet D were letters from homeowners whose properties were condemned and eventually bought by the same shell entities used in the payment trails. A civil suit filed in 1990, docket number 90-C-231, according to a photocopy of the complaint, alleged fraudulent valuation and coercion for several properties around Lockhart Creek. The suit was settled out of court, records show, with "terms confidential" stamped across the docket entry. The settlement did not lead to criminal charges. To date, public archives list no criminal indictment connected directly to Tri-State for illegal dumping in Millbrook. That absence of criminal follow-through is a crucial point. Our review of county prosecutor files shows a preliminary review in 1991 that concluded insufficient evidence for criminal intent, despite the odd payment patterns and the GPR findings that, decades later, still show unnatural fill. The prosecutor's memo, stamped Case Review 1991, opined that environmental infractions could have been administrative neglect rather than criminal conspiracy. The ledger books and the Polaroids remain, documented and dated, but the state never brought charges on that basis. Families lost land or relocated. Records do not fully account for who profited and why. There is one recorded arrest directly tied to Millbrook's broader economic maneuvers, but it concerns a different offense. In 1996, a tri-state subcontractor was indicted for falsifying environmental disposal manifests in a separate county and convicted of misdemeanor counts, according to court records. That conviction did not, on the face of the public record, connect to the payments we found in Cabinet D. It created, instead, a legal gray area. A company with a blemished record, political allies in a preservation committee, and a scattering of private settlements that make a tidy criminal case hard to assemble decades later. Part of what made the files so unnerving was a small set of personal items tucked between invoices, an old hymn book, pages folded and yellowed, and a key ring with a single plastic tag that read Willow Creek B&B. The hymn book pulled our attention away from money and toward memory. A cassette tape labeled Mount Zion Hymns 9-2-87-2200 lay folded beneath it. When audio analysts played the tape, they found something impossible to dismiss: a chorus of voices singing in a sanctuary, a recording that, by its tape label, should have been made during a Sunday evening service. But the recording's provenance was tangled. It had been placed with the township file months after the alleged date, and the cassette itself had different manufacturing stamps than the other media in the box. Someone had deliberately stored it with the cabinet's bureaucratic detritus. This confluence of transactional documents and devotional objects made the case feel less like a ledger and more like a ledger haunted by memory. Is it possible for environmental crime and communal trauma to live in the same file drawer? The papers suggested yes, and pointed to deeper institutional complicity in a town that rewarded silence. When we published an early report about what we found in Raymond's attic, readers wrote in with their own small confirmations, recollections of trucks at night, of sudden condemnations, of a county official who looked like he had been paid off. None of those memories were sufficient for indictment. Even the GPR scans, no matter how clear to a geophysicist, do not translate into criminal guilty knowledge.
The pattern, though, is there. A region whose land was altered in ways the public documents cannot fully account for, and whose human consequences remain undercompensated. We stopped at the quarry's edge and smelled the river. It carries whatever was put into it that night in the 1980s, and that smell was, for the locals, an ordinary presence, the kind of soaked smell that becomes a background truth. A woman who lived near Lockhart Creek for 40 years told us, softly, that when she boiled water for tea, she would sometimes think of the trucks and feel as if she were boiling with the town's quiet. That sentence, "I boiled with the town's quiet," is how she described the sensation. It is not a legal argument. It is a witness report about living among paper trails and small compromises that add up. After the cabinet story reached an audience, a small but important lead came in: a photocopy of a tri-state internal memo, a purchase requisition for disposal drums, with a notation in the margin: "Use Millbrook site as temporary hold." The sender and recipient fields were redacted in the photocopy, but the memo carried a lasting trail: a stamp from a private waste hauler dated September 1986, and a receipt stub with an employee's signature that matched the payroll stub found in Cabinet D. It is procedural detail, bookkeeping if you like, but in aggregate, it maps an operation that moved material at night and resettled the land on which dozens of people once lived. We could have stayed on that thread for the entire series, following check stubs and subpoenaing bank records and re-interviewing every resident in the county. Instead, we used the Cabinet D files as an anchor for the first narrative in this series, a portrait of how environmental harm and civic silence intertwine. The case remains open in the public imagination because the records point to misconduct but stop short of a single provable criminal scheme with named convicts tied to all charges. The settlement dockets, the GPR scans, the Polaroids, and the oral histories are all real. The absence of a final legal reckoning is likewise real. If this episode is the kind of investigative reconstruction you want more of, and if you want the documents we cite scanned and linked, subscribe to Fear Files. We keep a running archive of the evidence we used and a secure tip line for anyone who holds documents related to these cases. From there, we drove past fields where blades of grass flickered silver in a late afternoon wind, and toward a small white church on a hill whose steeple had leaned for decades. Mount Zion Baptist Church is a place where hymns have always been thick as dust. On Sunday mornings, the room vibrated with old voices, and the organ breath sounded like a small engine. The case we encountered there began with a single cassette tape, the one found in Cabinet D, but quickly became about more than a tape. It became a host of recordings, testimonies, and one nagging piece of evidence: audio files captured by visitors that recorded singing inside the sanctuary at times when the church was locked and empty. Mount Zion sits at the end of a one-lane road lined with oaks whose roots lift the shoulder of the asphalt. The sanctuary's heavy doors are chained. The key was kept for years by Mrs. Patterson, a longtime organist who had played at the church for 45 years. In the late 1980s, she recorded hymns on cassette to preserve the choir's arrangements. She told us she made personal recordings for the folks up in the nursing home, and that she always labeled her tapes by date and hymn. When a neighbor brought her a cassette and said, "This isn't yours," she was certain the tape with 9/2/87/2200 on the label was not one she made. The tape's audio file, when we had it digitized and analyzed, revealed layered vocal harmonies captured with an unusual acoustic signature. An acoustician we consulted noted that the recording contained reverb consistent with a large sanctuary, but also micro-reflections that suggested multiple discrete sources at slight delays, an effect sometimes caused by multiple microphones placed at separate locations. Yet the technical metadata on the digital transfer showed the tape itself was a home cassette recorded to one track. The analyst's note, labeled Audio Analysis, Mount Zion, 11/24/2019, concluded, multiple phase offsets present, unexplained layering, no evidence of overdubbing at source, environmental sounds consistent with empty building at time of capture. The tape was not alone.
Over the years, several residents and curious visitors claimed to have recorded hymn-like sounds inside Mount Zion at odd hours. One caller, who asked to remain anonymous, told us he had driven past the church at 2:17 a.m. and listened to a full-bodied hymn coming from the locked building. He recorded his phone audio, a thin file, time-stamped, with a low humming chorus drowned half by wind. An audio forensics specialist compared the visitor's phone recording to Mrs. Patterson's original tapes and to the cassette labeled 9287-2200. The specialist's report, Audio Comparison, Mount Zion, noted similarities in timbre and phrasing across recordings, but concluded the late-night audio exhibited frequencies not present in the church's known instrumentation. The report's language was careful. Unaccounted acoustic phenomena in several recordings, plausibility of natural explanation reduced but not eliminated. Why would hymn-like singing be recorded in an empty, locked church? Some locals suggested a simple answer: a nearby youth group practicing late on occasion, wind through vents, or cars idling in the churchyard. Others offered a different, quieter observation: that sounds sometimes linger where things happen, that the sanctity of a place preserves echoes of community life.
We recorded both the technical reports and the intangible comments. The tape in Cabinet D had been stored with financial papers, as if someone wanted a quiet piece of the town's soul catalogued alongside its ledgers. There is a human strain woven through the Mount Zion mystery. Mrs. Patterson, who lived alone in a clapboard house down the lane, began waking at night and aching with a kind of sorrow she described as too full. She told her niece that sometimes, when the town lights dimmed, she could hear hymns even inside her kitchen. She kept a journal. One entry dated October 12, 1990, recorded simply, "They sing when I think of those who left." That line is not forensic evidence, but it is a witness statement about grief. The church's archives, prayer lists, funeral registers, and membership rolls list a cluster of people who disappeared from the town in the 1980s and 1990s under various circumstances: moves, drownings, and a handful of deaths listed as accidental. The register entries end abruptly for some families, names crossed out with address unknown. When we asked the current pastor about the tapes, he handed us a small envelope of photocopies, letters from families who had moved, newspaper clippings about an insurance dispute in 1988, and a note from a visiting preservationist who had written, "This church carries old voices. Do not treat them like property." The pastor's voice was low when he added, "People say the church sings when there is remembering that needs to be done." The pastor's framing did not explain the acoustic anomalies, but it helped us see why these recordings had become a kind of evidence, an audio map of memory. We visited Mount Zion at night with a field recorder and a small crew of volunteers. We followed the standard forensic procedure: metadata capture, chain of custody documentation, and a two-person witness of the recorder's activation. We recorded nothing unusual the first night. The second night, an hour after we left, a volunteer who stayed behind sent us a voice memo. It captured a faint chorus, a human warmth thin as linen but undeniable. The volunteer's note attached to the file read, "Recorder left in Pew 5, file 2019.11.02_0217, device Zoom H4n, sample rate 48K. The acoustic analysis we later commissioned found the volunteer's recording contained harmonics present in the 9/2/87 cassette, as well as frequencies matching the visitor's phone recording. The analyst concluded, again cautiously, patterns of harmonic overlap suggest periodic recurrence, not consistent with vehicle or wind noise alone. We drew a map of the recordings, their times, and their microphone positions. If one wanted to find a natural explanation, one could propose all sorts of mechanisms: standing waves, structural resonances, nighttime insects, or a pipe organ malfunction. The technical reports considered and rejected many of those possibilities. Nothing in the listed equipment that produced the sounds could be located in the building at the respective times, and yet the choir appeared in different recordings, singing in the same space despite the absence of people. At the heart of Mount Zion's mystery is a set of personal tragedies. A family who lived in the parish house in the late 1980s reported a string of sleepless nights. Eventually, they left town. Their son, who was a teenager at the time, later told us in an interview that the family felt watched and that the singing made us think of funerals in places we never wanted to be. For them, as for others, the audio files were less an eerie novelty than a symptom of a town carrying the ache of loss. We pulled together the technical reports, the original cassette digitizations, and the oral histories, and compiled a dossier. The dossier did not prove the supernatural. It showed people hearing choruses where choruses should not be, and provided documented records of those sounds. Our language in the file reflects that reality. Unexplained, unaccounted for acoustic occurrences, multiple independent recordings, no clear natural source identified. For the families, evidence and meaning overlap. For investigators, the case remains a set of anomalies best described as unexplained. We left Mount Zion with two things, a copy of the cassette and a night's recording that required more analysis. Our acoustic specialist, in a follow-up email, wrote, "Mount Zion contains repeated acoustic events with characteristics not readily explained by ambient environmental factors. Additional high-fidelity recordings over multiple nights recommended." We also carried a human fragment, Mrs. Patterson's hymn book with pressed flowers inside, a private archive of mourning. That book, like the key under the ceramic frog, was a small object that opened something larger. The third case in this series moves from hymns in a sanctuary to images captured on trail cameras in the wiregrass of Koneku National Forest, where a wildlife surveyor recorded a creature that looks neither the deer nor the bear the region recognizes. The surveyor's photos are grainy at first glance, a dark, upright shape caught at 2:03 a.m. on a motion-activated camera. But interpreter, investigator, and juror look at such photos and ask the same hard questions. Who placed the camera? When exactly was it triggered? Do the timestamps match the camera's internal clock? Was the photographer or the trail a person walks on likely to be tampered with? The camera belonged to an independent wildlife surveyor contracted to monitor an endangered ground-nesting bird population. The surveyor, who asked to be identified only as an independent contractor, recalled setting the camera on a ridge above a game trail after months of missing nests. He described the night the camera tripped as windless and still, a quiet night.
When he checked the camera at dawn, he found a single frame that changed the course of his work, a narrow silhouette, limb proportions that did not align with local species, and a gait pattern visible across 5 consecutive frames. He sent the images to a local ranger and to an online cryptozoology forum. Within days, he was dealing with journalists, anonymous threats, and curious tourists. We obtained the original SD card and performed a forensic extraction. The file metadata, file names, timestamps, and the camera's serial number matched the contractor's written log. The technician's report, Digital Forensics, Concu Camera 3, concluded the images were not digitally altered on the card and that the camera's internal timecode aligned with the GPS-synced clock the surveyor had set. The frames, when converted to higher resolution with standard interpolation algorithms, showed anatomical details, a narrow chest, long arms relative to leg length, and an elongated stride. a plaster cast was later taken of large, splayed prints found near the line of sight. The cast measured 14 inches from heel to toe and showed a pronounced midfoot ridge. A local independent wildlife biologist, whose name we will not publish per their request, examined the plaster cast and stated, in a written letter provided to us, that the print could not be immediately matched to any known small mammal or bear in the region. The biologist's assessment was careful. Anomalous relative to known canid or ursid morphology. Further morphological and DNA analysis recommended. The DNA recommendation would be crucial. Its absence would leave the case in the realm of credible sightings rather than proof. Late in our reporting, a lab report arrived. Partial mitochondrial DNA extracted from degraded hair sample, sequence insufficient for conclusive species determination. Presents closest match to primate lineage at approximately 92% similarity, but does not fully resolve. The notation indefinido appears across the lab file, and rightfully so. A partial match does not equal identification. The hair was degraded, possibly by environmental exposure, and the sample size was small. The lab's conclusion did not prove the existence of an unknown upright biped. It did, however, rule out a simple misclassification of a known animal based on the hair sample alone. The surveyor, pressed by locals and readers of the forum alike, took additional precautions. He moved cameras, placed motion-triggered audio recorders, and staged bait with wildlife-safe feed in hopes of capturing clearer images. On one night, he captured a second set of images, a figure crossing a creek with a careful, measured step. The camera's infrared tone revealed heat signatures that were inconsistent with a human wearing clothing, but also inconsistent with known large mammals. The infrared overlay, when analyzed, showed an upright thermal profile with heat concentration along shoulders and upper torso. Local hunters, when shown images, suggested possible explanations. A homeless person traveling at night, an escaped exotic pet, or a hoax. The surveyor insisted he would not have staged such images. He provided the camera setup log, the GPS track of his vehicle, and timestamps that correlated his presence away from the site. We verified his log through his service invoices and through a check stub demonstrating payment for equipment for the monitoring project. Those items bolstered his credibility, but did not settle the central question: what did the camera actually capture? The photographic evidence, the casts, and the partial DNA sample compose a cluster of documents that resist convenient closure. The ranger, Daniel Cooper, who oversees the Concu region, issued a public statement advising caution and requesting anyone with conclusive evidence come forward. He also noted the impact on the local ecosystem. An increased presence of curious visitors had begun to disturb the nesting birds the project aimed to protect. That unintended consequence, publicity threatening conservation efforts, is part of the ethical complexity of the case. We sat with the surveyor in a gas station diner and looked at the frames on his phone. He kept a steady hand and a measured voice as he chronicled the nights of trail maintenance and the sudden arrival of visitors, scientists, enthusiasts, and pranksters. His story had become a crucible, a scientific undertaking muddled by public fascination and the incomplete nature of evidence. At the time we left Concu, 3 elements were clear. First, the images and casts were authentic to the devices used and the scene as described. Second, biological analysis was inconclusive. It raised new questions without providing a definitive answer. Third, the social repercussions, visitors, harassment, and ecological interference were real and immediate. The mystery of whatever moved in the wiregrass was documented and unresolved, and it had shifted the community's daily life. We stopped our reporting in the middle of the Concu Trail, not because there was nothing more to find, but because the shape of the investigation was changing, from a question about a creature in the night to an ethical question about what happens when a rural place is thrust under a public spotlight. The surveyor remained available, the ranger had initiated a controlled camera program, and the DNA lab had asked for more samples that so far had not materialized. On the drive back across the county line, the air held the thin smell of crushed pine. Each of these stories, the Cabinet D revelations, the Mount Zion tapes, the Concu photographs, carries within it a particular sensory residue. The metallic tang of a quarry's runoff, the sibilant reverb of a closed sanctuary, the wet, earthy sting of wiregrass pressed after a night of motion. They are small facts, human and tactile, that remind us why paperwork matters and why the absence of a legal verdict can feel like a moral absence. Scene setting. Riverside Recovery sat on a low rise, brick and glass, its parking lot ringed by maples that shifted scarlet in autumn. The facility billed itself publicly as a neurological rehabilitation center for behavioral recalibration and marketed outpatient cognitive therapies to families seeking relief for hard-to-place relatives. Internally, Madison told us, there was a basement beneath the main wing, accessible only with 2 staff keycards and a paper logbook kept under glass. She described the basement as stale, with the clinical smell of ethanol and the sharper tang of disinfectant. Equipment receipts in her packet list a low-frequency stimulator, model H3, shipped to Riverside in June 1999. The manufacturer's serial number printed on the receipt matched a device photographed in situ during an inspection in 2004. Discovery. Madison's packet also included copies of consent forms, one page typed on Riverside letterhead, another hand-signed by P. Harrison, M.D., that purported to authorize adjustment sessions for inpatients. The forms were not addressed to named patients. Instead, they listed procedural codes and a line for guardian signature. A later government inspection report, DHS Inspection, Riverside Recovery 2010, noted that many patient charts in the basement wing had redacted guardian contact, paper unsigned. Madison's allegation was that some residents were subjected to procedures without informed consent under the pretense of therapeutic stabilization. In several witness statements filed with the inspector, patients recounted episodes of sedation followed by memory gaps and blank periods lasting hours. Evidence and analysis. We requested the original inspection file and found a trove of receipts, purchases of anesthetic-grade sedatives, tubing, and IV pumps, and, crucially, records of clinical repair to the H3 stimulator unit dated November 2000. A maintenance log stamped by an outside biomedical company, Harrison MedServe, recorded an emergency call and then a repair ticket. The ticket included a handwritten client note, use discretion. The technician's invoice 0047/1114-2000, lists labor and a part replaced and contains a redacted customer account number that, when cross-referenced with procurement files, matched Riverside's billing account. We subpoenaed the billing records and obtained a set of discharge forms redacted for privacy. Interspersed among these forms were notes in a clinical shorthand, AR/1112, session baseline, no family consent on file, and AR/1113, reduced agitation, memory lapse reported. Madison gave us a photocopy of an internal memo from a clinician named Dr. Harrison, the same name that appeared on the consent forms, dated January 2001 and marked for clinical director only.
The memo discussed protocol modifications to reduce disruptive vocalizations during recalibration cycles and referenced ancillary containment measures to be used for non-compliant subjects. We asked for comment from Riverside administrators. The facility's legal counsel replied with a short statement. Riverside categorically denies unauthorized care and asserts all therapies were administered with consent and oversight. The firm provided redacted consent paperwork and a list of state certifications. Where the records conflicted, the obvious friction point was the redaction and the absence of named guardians on basement log charts. The inspector's final summary report, DHS Closure Summary, Riverside 2012, noted numerous charting irregularities, failure to maintain guardian contact, recommended tighter oversight, and ordered training. It did not, as the public file shows, recommend criminal referral. Confrontation and outcome. Madison's report led to a criminal inquiry, but the public prosecutor's memo, 18-CR Report, Riverside Investigation Preliminary, concluded the available evidence suggested procedural malpractice rather than prosecutable assault. That memo is in the public file. No criminal charges were brought. An administrative fine followed. The Riverside Recovery Center paid a civil penalty and restructured its basement services. The H3 stimulator was decommissioned and the purchase invoices ceased appearing in later procurement records. Dr. Harrison's name disappears from the staff rosters after 2004. His current status is indefined in public registries. Lingering mystery. What troubles former patients and staff is not merely the missing criminal verdict, but the experiential gap. Madison told us about a young man, Evan, name changed, who was admitted for a short stay and later emerged with a changed personality and patchy memory, like he had a seam in him, Madison said. Evan's family pursued civil counsel and eventually settled. Medical records released in the settlement were heavily redacted, and the treatment codes remained clinical jargon for behavioral recalibration. The human effect remains unresolved. Patients remember intervals of being done to without fully comprehending what those procedures were. The official record contains receipts, a decommissioned device, and a fine. It does not, in public view, account for the subjective damage families report. When we left the Riverside parking lot, the smell of disinfectant stuck to our clothes like a faint accusation. From a clinical basement, we moved to a different kind of temporal dislocation, a highway where a long-haul trucker found, briefly, a town that should not exist in its present form. This is the Riverside Town in Time case. A man named Thomas Reed, a driver with 20 years on the road, filed a statement with County Dispatch after an October night run when his logistics route took him past a narrow side road and into a pocket of memory that did not match his maps. Scene setting. It was a field-black night with low fog, and Thomas's rig was heavy with freight. A cracked sign read Old County 7, Scenic Route. He drove the turn and found a street that opened into a settlement of clapboard houses, gas pumps with analog dials, and a diner with neon so amber it seemed carved from the past. He pulled off and by his watch spent 20 minutes refueling and getting coffee from a counter girl whose name tag read Estelle. He took a photograph of the station attached to his dispatch log. The image's metadata later showed a timestamp consistent with his route and with his truck's GPS. But when Thomas returned the following day with a constable at his side, following the coordinates logged on his GPS, he found a field, plowed, flat, and empty, not the town he had stopped in. Discovery. Thomas's story entered the public record because he filed a formal dispatch report and because he kept the receipt from the diner, a paper slip with rounded corners dated that night's time and stamped Old County Diner, Est 1953. He mailed a photocopy of the receipt to a local historian who maintains a catalog of long-closed businesses. The historian checked archives and found no listing for the diner after 1969. Town maps overlaid from 1955 and 1980 showed the road aligning with a small hamlet that had been dissolved and absorbed into lowland farmland in the 1970s. The coordinates Thomas recorded corresponded to a patch of county property that, in aerial photos, appears as a field in 1990 and 2000, with no built structures. Evidence and analysis. We obtained Thomas's original picture and had the image examined by an image analyst. The photographic examination, Thomas Reed, 10/12/2017 report, noted the image metadata matched the camera and the camera's serial number. The analyst also compared the background details to historical aerial photos and concluded the building facades in Thomas's photo matched architectural styles common in mid-century small towns. But attempts to locate physical evidence at the coordinates, foundation fragments, artifacts, or even a cigarette butt came up empty. Soil cores taken from the site, logged as soil core sample 17A, showed no signs of modern construction debris at shallow depths. We interviewed other drivers and locals. An older resident, who asked to remain unnamed, told us about a seasonal migrant camp that had once sat in the area, but said it had been removed decades earlier. He offered a memory. "My daddy used to say the road sometimes gives you back yesterday if the fog was thick." That line reads like folklore, but is, crucially, part of the social memory map attached to that stretch of pavement. Confrontation/outcome. The county dispatched a deputy after Thomas filed the report. The deputy's incident log, Dispatch 2017-1012 D103, records a search and a negative find.
Because no crime was reported, the incident remained in dispatch archives as a curiosity. Thomas later told us the episode cost him his job. He was placed on administrative leave for losing time on a freight run, and after a string of performance notes, he left the company. He maintains the receipt and the photograph as his only proof. The dispatcher who responded still shakes his head at the memory of that trucker who thought he'd driven into a postcard. But he also kept the photograph in his desk. Lingering mystery. The Town in Time case sits between folklore and something more documentable. A photograph with verifiable origin, a receipt, and a missing physical location. Our conclusion is cautious. The data shows a consistent personal account and trace artifacts with provenance markers. It does not, however, allow us to assert a physical manifestation of temporal displacement. The county's official position is neutral. No evidence of unpermitted structures was found at the coordinates, and the town's archive remains silent. For Thomas, and for the small number of other drivers who have reported similar displacements along back roads in the region, the experience altered the trajectories of their lives in ways that paperwork cannot entirely explain. Next in our sequence is a case that shifted our reporting into the domain of murder for profit. Lockhart Springs, a lakeside community where an insurance investigator named Joshua Brennan began to see a pattern in drowning claims that did not add up. This story is one of documents aligning into a troubling outline. Claims forms, boat rental logs, and an emergent social network of profiteering. Scene setting. Lockhart Springs was a cluster of vacation cottages on a narrow inlet. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a spate of drowning incidents occurred there, each with similar after-patterns. A quick insurance payout, a property sale to companies that later subdivided the land, and, in some cases, anomalies in the boating logs. Joshua, an insurance investigator assigned to verify a particularly large claim, reviewed file after file and found details that suggested a more organized operation than random accidents. Discovery. Joshua's review began with claim number LS891321, a drowning reported on August 31, 1989. The claim form lists a victim, the mechanism, drowning, accidental, and witness statements that were, in places, sparse and similar in phrasing. When Joshua sought rental records for the boat used that night, he found the logbook entries were messy, with time gaps and a handwriting sample that matched entries from other incidents. Joshua cross-referenced those handwriting samples to a local B&B register and found the same stylized signature in the guest book of Mrs. Hughes's Willow Glen B&B in nearby Millbrook. Evidence and analysis. Joshua assembled a binder, claim forms, boat maintenance receipts, guest logs, and a set of photocopied checks showing payments to a small fleet operator. He requested bank records under an investigative subpoena and obtained a transaction ledger showing a series of withdrawals and transfers labeled dock fees coinciding with claim settlements. One file, Insurance Investigation LS89321, contains a line, Unexplained disbursement, pay to operator Carson Marine, see invoice 112. That invoice, when obtained from county clerk's microfilm, shows a payment to Robert Carson, a local agent listed as a boat broker and a registered owner of several skiffs used for rentals. Joshua interviewed People, a former rental attendant who later said she walked off the job after seeing certain men arrive at night with coolers and cash, a grieving sister who found the report of her brother's death too thinly documented to satisfy inquest questions. In a court hearing later in the decade, some of the financial trails were examined. The inquest file, Inquest, Locke County, 1991, considered the timing and the unusual transfers, but the coroner's report listed each death as accidental drowning. Civil suits followed in several cases. One settlement, docket 91C118, remains public and shows a confidential settlement paid by a homeowners association to a claimant. That settlement, Joshua concluded, corresponded with a spike of property transfers. Confrontation and outcome. Joshua's persistence led to a grand jury referral in 1993, Grand Jury Referral Lockhart Matters, but the grand jury returned no indictments on murder charges. The files show, however, that several insurance claims were later denied on grounds of material misrepresentation, and one small-time boat operator pled guilty in 1994 to falsifying rental logs in exchange for a reduced sentence. That plea did not, in the public record, connect him to a larger conspiracy. Joshua told us the legal outcome was anticlimactic, partial financial accountability in a few nodes, but not the wholesale criminal culpability his binder suggested might exist. Lingering mystery. Why did certain properties end up in the hands of the same shadowed investors? Why were the same handwriting patterns and cash flows visible across files? The documents show irregularities and suggest a coordinated pattern, yet fail to produce the single chain that would support murder-for-profit convictions. Families remain unconsoled. The waters of Lockhart keep the memory of those who died and the legal ambiguity of those deaths. The coroner's reports are clear on mechanisms, the financial ledgers are clear on transfers, and yet motive and conspiratorial proof remain out of reach beyond suspicion.
From Water to the Road, County Road 47. This is the story of a scream caught on a recorder and the acoustic thread that wound through multiple cases. The recording in question was made by a podcaster who was investigating rural hauntings and local myths. On a summer night, he parked and recorded ambient sounds after receiving a tip about a woman heard screaming near an old bridge. The podcaster later uploaded a raw clip to our team. Scene setting. County Road 47 is a two-lane stretch of pavement flanked by loblolly pines and cut timber. On a humid night, cicadas fill the canopy and the air tastes of iron. The podcaster's recording, CR4707-12-2343, captured a thin file, a female voice in distress, a peal that wavered and died into the trees. The podcaster preserved the device metadata. Device Zoom H1, audio sample rate 44.1K, timestamp 2343. Discovery. The audio was short but distinct. We sent it to the same audio analyst who had examined the Mount Zion tapes. The analyst's report, Acoustic Analysis CR47 Recording 09-10-2019, yielded a finding that became the center of the case. The spectral fingerprint of the scream matched frequencies found in several older files in county archives, including a 1986 911 tape from a nearby precinct, 911-86-432, and a voicemail left at a local police station in 1992, VM-92-07-08. The analysts wrote, "Spectral and harmonic profile analysis shows congruent features across multiple files, probable same voice source or reproducing mechanism. Further analysis recommended." We requested originals of the archived tapes. The 1986 911 recording was in county evidence. The 1992 voicemail was preserved on microcassette and transcribed. Both older files contained moments of a woman's cry or distressed calling that, when overlaid in the lab, conformed to the same amplitude envelope and vocal tract resonance signatures present in the podcaster's recording. The coroner's report associated with the 1986 tape, Coroner 86-127-Drowning, listed a female remains found near the bridge that year. Identification at the time was incomplete. The report noted scavenging by wildlife and suggested skeletal remains. The case was officially unresolved. Evidence and analysis. The overlay was arresting. The lab could not definitively prove the files belonged to the same woman, but it showed a high degree of similarity. The analyst's jargon is careful. Statistical likelihood of same voice source given model parameters is elevated. However, sample degradation and recording channel differences preclude absolute identification.
In lay terms, the recordings are similar enough to suggest a common origin, but not enough to certify identity. The podcaster's clip reignited interest. A family who had reported a daughter missing in 1986 came forward and provided a photograph.
A partial DNA sample recovered from bones cataloged in evidence at that time had been stored but never fully profiled. In 2019, advances in mitochondrial DNA extraction allowed a partial match between the remains and the family's reference sample. mtDNA match, partial, probative, but not conclusive, reads the lab stamp. The coroner then updated the record. The remains likely belonged to the missing woman from 1986, but the method yielded a partial identification due to degraded DNA. For the family's grieving arc, this was relief and complication, something named but not fully accounted for. Confrontation, outcome. The renewed attention produced an administrative review of cold cases in the county and led to a 2019 cold case hearing, Cold Case Review CR 47, where audio overlays and the partial mtDNA result were presented. The hearing did not produce an arrest. Investigative threads remain. There is a more troubling angle. Multiple recordings across decades suggest the same voice, or at least the same acoustic signature, appears at the same location over time. How does one explain recurring screams tied to multiple incidents? The experts we consulted offered plausible mechanisms: recordings reused, environmental resonance, or human mimicry, but none could neatly account for the pattern. The recordings remain documented anomalies. Lingering image. We drove County Road 47 at dusk. The bridge light refracted on the blacktop, and the smell of wet wood rose from the creek. The podcaster's file hangs in the archive like a small, brittle thing, documented and ear-wrenching, tied to coroner paperwork and partial DNA. For families, the sound stitched together moments of disappearance. For investigators, it is an evidence thread that insists upon attention but refuses tidy closure. The last story in our series takes us into the forest and into a case that crossed into the criminal system with a measure of closure: the Talladega Ranger impersonator. Marcus Whitley was a park ranger trainee whose notes and field diary became crucial in exposing a man who preyed on hikers while wearing a uniform. Scene setting. Talladega National Forest receives thousands of visitors every year. Trails wind under pines, and a culture of self-reliant hikers inhabits the region. Marcus Whitley was a young graduate with a ranger badge not yet issued. He volunteered on weekends and learned the trails. In late 2003, Marcus encountered a man giving safety talks at a trailhead who wore a ranger's green and carried a laminated county ID. The man, later identified as an individual named Robert Carson, name appears in public court filings, was not a member of the Forest Service. Marcus's field diary, page dated 11/8/2003, records his discomfort. MC noticed uniform off, badge not official, told to go on foot patrol. Subject asked about night trails. Each one in our series ends with things we can document and things we cannot. Cabinet D provided photocopies, GPR scans, GPR scan Site 6A 06/12/2019, and a canceled check that traces to Tri-State. Mount Zion yielded cassette Mount Zion 09/02/87 and acoustic reports. Concu supplied camera card for Camera 3/02/03 and partial mtDNA. Riverside Recovery left procurement invoices and an inspection file. The Truckers Town presented a photograph with matched metadata and a diner receipt. Lockhart Springs brought a binder of claims and a grand jury referral with no indictment. County Road 47 produced a podcaster's file, CR 4707122343, and associated coroner records. Talladega concluded with court docket 04-CR-299 and convictions. What unites them is not a single explanation, but a pattern. Places that, by virtue of their geography and social makeup, collect secrets, and records that either reveal or obscure those secrets.
Small towns with small circulations of power can bend documentation to advantage. A preservation committee memo can look like routine administration until it sits beside Polaroids that show drums lowered into creeks. A cassette taped to an attic shelf can look like a piece of local devotion until audio analysis shows anomalous layering. A trail camera can capture a frame that invites both scientific curiosity and mass myth. Patient charts can document therapeutic intent or serve as linguistic tools for erasure. A trucker's receipt can anchor a man whose life changed after a single detour. An insurance investigator can assemble spreadsheets and find patterns that juries cannot convert into murder convictions. A recorded scream can stitch decades together and still refuse to explain itself. We reconstruct each case from witness testimony, police reports, court filings, audio and photographic evidence, GPR data, and first-hand fieldwork. Where a legal outcome exists, we report it precisely. Where the record is incomplete, we use the candid language of evidence: alleged, documented, unexplained, indefinito. We take care not to make supernatural claims where the material does not support them. We do not attempt to force patterns into a grand theory. Instead, we present the threads and leave the judgment to the public and to further investigation. A common refrain in our interviews was this: places keep memory. People spoke of towns holding a pain, of sonic echoes that feel like mourning, of land reshaped by clandestine transactions. Those were not legal arguments, they were human ones. When you listen to a cassette in a church that seems to sing alone, you cannot reduce the experience to ledger lines. When a photograph shows a figure whose morphology resists classification, you know that science and doubt will push the explanation outward for a while longer. Practical impact and ethical notes. In several cases, our reporting unearthed material that generated fresh leads.
After we published the Cabinet D documents, a reader submitted a photocopy of a tri-state internal memo we had not previously seen. It confirmed the receipt trail and led to more targeted GPR scans at a secondary site. After we broadcast portions of the Mount Zion audio dossier, a retired choir director provided an undated rehearsal tape that expanded the archive and invited new acoustic comparison. We verified the provenance of those submissions and included them in a public dossier. When tips arrive, we follow chain of custody protocols before adding material to the public archive. We also encountered ethical minefields. The Concu camera images drew crowds that threatened the nesting birds they were meant to protect. The podcaster's clip of County Road 47 summoned unvetted commenters who speculated wildly and impeded official inquiry. In every case, we balanced the public's right to know against the potential harm of publicity. We withheld certain sensitive images at the request of family members and redacted identifying details of survivors according to their wishes. The one guiding principle in these choices was victim dignity. What remains unexplained and why it matters? The title of this series names the central condition: 8 real horror stories that still have no explanation. That statement is not hyperbole. Some of the documentary vectors point to misconduct and, in some cases, to successful prosecution. Talladega offers a measure of closure. Tri-state subcontractor cases in other counties resulted in convictions for falsified manifests, but several arcs resist a single institutional reckoning. Cabinet D leaves us with unpublished names and private settlements. Lockhart Springs shows patterns but not indictable conspiracy. Mount Zion offers acoustic anomalies without a mechanical origin. Concu produces partial DNA without definitive identification. County Road 47 attaches voice fingerprints to cold bones in ways that comfort and unsettle at once. The absence of a tidy answer is itself evidence of how institutional silence, lost records, degraded physical traces, and human reticence conspire to produce unsettled endings. We close with an image: a small iron key under a ceramic frog, a hymnal with pressed flowers, a plaster cast of an anonymous print, a maintenance log with "use discretion" scribbled on the corner. These objects, tactile and ordinary, accumulate into patterns that point to truths harder to prosecute than they are to see. They are the artifacts of towns that have quietly transformed themselves and of individuals who either suffered or profited in those transformations. If you have documents, photographs, or credible tips about any of these cases, we will add verified material to an online archive linked below. For privacy and safety, we accept submissions through a secure tip line. We will only publish materials with verifiable provenance and with permission from relevant parties when necessary.
The file list at the linked page contains the documents we referenced: GPR scan, Site 6A, June 12, 2019, Incident Report 4J, Cabinet D photocopy set, Raymond Estate, Mount Zion cassette digitization, tape 9287, Acoustic Analysis, Mount Zion, November 24, 2019, Digital Forensics, Concu Camera 3, DHS Inspection, Riverside Recovery, 2010, Photographic Examination, Thomas Reed, October 12, 2017, INS Investigation, LS 89321, Coroner's Reports 86126 and updates, CR47 recording, CR47-07-2343, and court dockets including State v. Carson 04-CR299. We cite these to make clear the documentary basis of our reconstructions. We do not close the book on any of these stories. Some threads may one day yield fuller explanations: a bank ledger turned over, a forgotten memo located in a box, a genetic profile refined enough to provide certainty. Until then, the files stand as partial truths, evidence that points, and circumstantial shapes that require attention. We drove back to Raymond before sunset and placed the copies of Cabinet D into the evidence binder for secure archiving. The smell of the quarry and the taste of river-brewed tea lingered like old argument. We thought of the people who had written notes in the margins of memos, the organist who kept tapes, the nurse with a packet of receipts, and the ranger trainee who kept a diary. Their traces were small but persistent, and they asked two things of us: to look and to keep looking. If you want to review the documents and audio files we used in this investigation, the links are below. If you have information that could help resolve any of these cases, please submit it through our secure tip line. Details and submission instructions are provided on the page. We will add verified materials to the public dossier, noting provenance and maintaining chain of custody. This series is reconstructed from witness testimony, police reports, court filings, audio recordings, GPR results, and first-hand accounts gathered over years of reporting. It is not an indictment of a single force. It is an attempt to map a county's collisions of bureaucracy, environment, memory, and loss. The records are what they are: partial, stubborn, and sometimes horrifying in their ordinary textures. The unexplained remains: voices in empty churches, photographs that do not fit known species, receipts from diners that leave no diner behind, because record and experience do not always reconcile neatly. Thank you for listening. Detailed sources, scanned documents, and instructions for submitting tips are linked below. If you have information about any case in this series, use the secure tip line. If you possess original documents, we will work with you to preserve chain of custody and to make sure those records are treated with care. These stories are not finished. They are open files that, with the right addition of evidence, might someday close with a fuller accounting.
Until then, they remain, as the rivers carry it, things that will not stay buried.